Welcome to Law Easy. My name is Marty Schenkman, and I'm joined by Jonathan Blotmacher. And we're going to have a brief discussion, an overview of planning for spousal lifetime access trusts, also known by the acronym SLATs. Jonathan, why are SLATs such a hot or really critical topic in mid-2020?
Well, Marty, this goes back to 2012 when we thought that the estate and gift tax exemptions were going to drop from 5 million down to 1 million. And people wanted to use those exemptions before they disappeared, but wanted to be able to have some access to those assets at a later time. And one of the strategies considered were these SLATs, where one spouse would create a trust for the other spouse, and the other spouse would create a trust for the first spouse. And they wanted to do that so it didn't fall under either the creditor or tax reciprocal trust doctrine. Now we're here in 2020. We have a much bigger exemption, about $11.5 million, which even if nothing is done legislatively until 2026, it will be cut in half. But I think everybody realizes with the amount that the government has had to spend on the coronavirus pandemic, that they're going to have to raise taxes. Indeed, just today it was announced in every newspaper that even though most of us in this nation have lost wealth, the billionaires in this country have had their wealth greatly expand. And that means that when Congress gets around to paying for this, they're going to go after the estate tax. Exemptions are going to go down. And as a consequence, it's really appropriate for people, including spouses, to consider using their exemptions right now, especially before the election, because if the Democrats take hold of the administration after the election, you can bet your bottom dollar there will be a very swift increase in tax, including a reduction of the estate, gift, and GST exemptions.
And it certainly seems that many people learned the hard way from the so-called buyer's remorse in 2012, that structuring a trust that was to benefit children or grandchildren and others may have been great to save exemption, but it did nothing to provide access, and that led to tremendous buyer's remorse, not only because the exemption didn't go down, but people regretted not having access to the money. So SLATs are clearly probably one of the most popular tools for married couples in mid-2020. So essentially all the SLAT is doing is it's a trust that, let's say, I set up and I name my spouse and descendants as beneficiaries. So that way my spouse as a beneficiary has access, hence the term, the name Spousal Lifetime Access Trust. So that's what a SLAT is. Now, how should we structure a SLAT? What states should we put the trust in? The default or simple answer is if you live in state X, you set husband and wife's trusts up in state X. But you may want to give some consideration to the following. I'll give one comment and let Jonathan elaborate on the better state choices. First, give thought to, and we're going to talk in a minute, time permitting, about the reciprocal trust doctrine. You want to have differences that are significant between the trusts. So if my trust and my wife's trust are set up in our home state, that's a similarity, not a difference. If I can create both trusts in different jurisdictions, so let's say I put my trust for the benefit of my spouse and descendants in my home state, and I create a trust for my spouse, for myself, and our descendants in Alaska, I now have two different states, different state laws, different default rules, different trustees. So using different states to differentiate is important. Another benefit of SLAT planning is to consider, if you don't live in one of the DAP jurisdictions, one of the 19 states that permit self-settled trusts and have better state laws governing trusts, is to create your SLAT in a better jurisdiction. Jonathan, maybe you want to comment on why that makes sense for SLATs.
Well, you can't be certain that either a creditor or the IRS won't contend that this is a trust in which you have retained an interest because of the reciprocal trust doctrine, or because when you die, you continue the trust for your wife. So the one that the wife creates for the husband, when the husband dies, she's going to want that trust to continue for her. So it may be that they're going to say these are really self-settled trusts, and as a consequence, the IRS and creditors will seek to try to pull it in. But if you created the trust properly in one of the domestic asset protection trust jurisdictions, and as Marty just mentioned, there are now 19 of those, including Connecticut, where Marty is now domiciled, well, you should be able to avoid creditor claims and to avoid estate tax inclusion on the basis that it was a self-settled trust.
Quick drafting or planning concept. If you're already doing that, why not put both trusts in separate DAP jurisdictions? So if you live in, for example, Florida, which doesn't accept DAPs, or if you live in more so New York or California, which don't accept DAPs, have one trust in Alaska and one in South Dakota. And that way you've differentiated the law. You've used different trustees because you're going to have to use an institutional trustee in each of those jurisdictions. And you've gotten that extra measure of protection that Jonathan suggested. And by using institutional trustees, and you can still have individuals acting in a number of other capacities, you've already strengthened the entire structure.
Marty, let me add here that, yes, you want to go to a DAP jurisdiction. And even if you want someone in your home state to, say, be the trustee just for making investments, don't do it. There's a case out there called In re Hubert, which I wrote up about in Trust and Estates magazine a few years ago, where a man in Washington state created an Alaska trust, but he was denied the benefits of the Alaska DAP legislation because all the other trustees happened to be in Washington, all the assets were in Washington, and he could not have really done it more. He just had a nominal Alaska trustee. If you're going to go and really try to do this, either as yourself, a domestic asset protection trust, or SLATs, non-reciprocal SLATs for you and your spouse, make sure you leave nothing in a jurisdiction which doesn't have DAP legislation, including, I'm going to suggest, not even a trust protector. So, for example, Marty creates his in Connecticut. His wife Patty creates her in Alaska. I don't want Marty putting in, for example, a relative of his, for example, Patty's son who lives in New York, to have any sort of role, because if the courts are upset with what's happened, they're going to say, aha, there was a connection to New York, or there was a connection to Florida or California, and they're going to try to bring it in. So really try to be very, very pure in setting it up.
We have about 2 minutes left, and we're going to try in 2 minutes to cover a lot of, highlight a number of other critical topics. Let me do one very quickly. Before you structure the SLAT, a common and sort of the traditional casebook approach is one spouse sets up trust for the other, and the other spouse sets up a trust for the first spouse. You may not need to do that. If your net worth is at a level, or the amount of assets you can transfer at a level, that it doesn't make sense for both spouses to transfer assets to use exemption, you may want just one trust. So if the most you can transfer in aggregate is, say, $8 million or $4 million, you're probably better off not having two SLATs with 4 million or 2 million each. You're better off having one SLAT with, say, 8 million, where you've used up most of one spouse's exemption before the decline preserved the other. Jonathan, we really only have a minute or so left. Quick comment on reciprocal trust doctrine and why that's so critical to address.
Well, under the reciprocal trust doctrine, if A creates a trust for B and B creates a trust for A, if they find out they're reciprocal, basically were created in consideration of each other, they will uncross them. So that the trust the husband created for the wife will be treated as though the wife created it for herself, and vice versa. And that's why you have to go to a domestic asset protection trust jurisdiction and follow all the rules on that. Pretend as though it is a self-settled trust in one of those jurisdictions. That's the best thing you can do, is to think that, well, maybe the reciprocal trust doctrine can apply, because there are no guarantees it won't apply. There's some very helpful case law out there, like a state of Levy decided by the tax court in the mid-1980s. But again, I'd go further than that. Make as many differences as you want, but psychologically think that these trusts may be uncrossed, and make sure that you're in a jurisdiction so they're not subject to creditor attachment, which will cause also IRS to say that they're includable in the estates of the spouses.
It's clear that there is an awful lot of detailed information to master and apply to properly plan, draft, implement, fund, and maintain once they're set up SLATs. Jonathan and I are doing a 2-hour training webinar to go in great detail through all the issues we've talked about and scores of other issues. Depending on the timing of when you view this, that webinar may be available to watch by signing up for it. And if it's after the webinar is played, that webinar will be posted as a recording along with the materials on shankmanlaw.com/webinars and on the Interactive Legal website as well, interactivelegal.com. Thank you for joining us. Please keep in mind that all the videos on this website, including this one, are for educational purposes only. Don't take any action without consulting appropriate professionals. Thank you for joining us.